Welcome to Rocking Our Prize. Michael Cook's A History of Islam is my favourite book of 2024. 1,000 pages jam-packed with fascinating details. And today I'm delighted to welcome Professor Michael Cook. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Alice. I really appreciate the fact that you like my book, and it's my pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's start off with the Middle East and North Africa. So some political scientists, like Basil Ahmed, argues that Arab conquest led to Mamluk institutions with slave soldiers, Ikta land grants, and clerics who preached obedience to the ruler. So this is religious authoritarianism. Amit Kuru has a slightly different argument, saying that this really emerged in the mid-11th century. How accurate is that characterization?
Okay, right. Let's keep this for the moment to the first few empires of Muslim history. So that would be the original caliphate, the results from the Arab conquests, then the Abbasids, then going to North Africa, the Almoravids, the Almohads, and let's stop there for now. So my answer is going to be yes, but. And to start with the yes, are these empires religious? Yeah, I would say so, very strongly. I mean, each of them starts with a religious movement, a movement with religious motivations, whatever other motivations get mixed up in it. And if you take the title caliph, caliph means either deputy of God or successor to God's prophet. Either way, it's an intrinsically religious title, unlike king or emperor. So yes, as far as religious is concerned, check mark. Then going to authoritarianism.
Wait, just to push back on that, I mean, so even if the Arab rulers were religious, and we know that Egyptians converted gradually, do you have any idea how well Ramadan was observed in the first few centuries of Islam by the ordinary masses?
Absolutely none. I mean, I could make a guess, which is that this is a completely irresponsible guess, that it's going to vary a lot, depending if you're in a city with a predominantly Muslim population, there's going to be a fairly high level of observance. And if you go out into a village where the ulama never appear, very likely there isn't going to be much. But that's a sheer guess, based on the fact that Ghazali, a figure whom you're familiar with, he remarks somewhere that, I mean, he takes it for granted that a peasant in a village wouldn't know how to pray. So if he doesn't know how to pray, I guess he probably isn't fasting in Ramadan.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I interrupted you. Back to your flow. Now for the authoritarianism.
Okay, yeah, authoritarianism. And I think, again, the answer is yes, in the sense that the caliph wants you to listen up and do what he tells you. He's not into checks and balances and that kind of thing. So, yes, but. And I think there's two big buts I have here. One is a kind of de facto but. I mean, look at the geography. Let's leave aside India and the very easternmost Islamic world. But if we're taking, say, Iran through to Morocco, it's not a very welcoming geography for a despot. And there's too much desert, too many mountains, too many wild tribes, not enough tame peasants. You want to set up an absolute monarchy there, good luck to you. So that's the de facto.
Wait a second. Let's have some clarification there, because I can totally understand that no regime could really police the Atlas Mountains, for example. But what about those cities? And this is this idea of, circumscription theory, for example, that where you have amazing agricultural land and decent livelihoods, you might want to stay in that place rather than, chance it in the barren desert or the unforgiving mountain. So is it possible in the fertile valleys, in the oases, that actually were more conducive to authoritarianism?
Right. I think, if you're going to do it anywhere in this region, do it in Egypt, where, right down to modern times, you still have a genuine peasant population, especially, perhaps exclusively in the Delta. So, I mean, yes, Egypt is special. Iraq was special until the economy went south in the 9th century. But I mean, compare that to the vast expanse of the plains of northern India, sort of a vast coherent agricultural area.
Yes.
Or the lowlands of China, again, a vast coherent agricultural area. Or you can say the same of Western Europe. The region we're talking about is just not in the same league, I think.
So when we talk about the difficult, how strong would you say state capacity was?
I would say it was not strong at all. I mean, the ability of the caliph to get something done in Baghdad is pretty good. His ability to get people in Tunisia to do what he wants is much more limited. And here we're talking obviously not just about the geographical conditions, but about the period. There are no modern communications. You want to send an order to Tunisia saying, do this. It's going to take a couple of months to get there. Be another couple of months before you hear back. I mean, we're in a world. Yep.
So Amit Kuru argues that the Islamic Golden Age ended because there was an emergent religious authoritarianism. He says, before the mid-11th century, the ulema were very independent and they were often traders and they didn't have to cozy up to the rulers. And he says this nascent alliance made everything go south. What do you think of that chronology and also the effect on Islamic science?
Okay, I think he has a good point. First of all, I think his chronology is right. I mean, it's in the 11th century that we get the real emergence of the madrasa as an institution that links the rulers to the ulama, where essentially the rulers by endowing madrasas, and it's not only rulers, but it's to a very considerable extent rulers. I mean, they're providing an educational institution which patronizes the ulama and then populates the bureaucracy. So, I mean,
and what led to that shift? What led to that shift, and why did it happen, and where did it happen?
I don't have a good answer to that question because you start off with Islamic education being completely informal, completely private, if you like. It goes on in mosques. Somebody sets up as a teacher, and if he attracts students, then he has a study circle, but there's no institution there. And somehow in the 10th century, an institution emerges, which is not something that happens all that often in Islamic history. I mean, it's a rather sort of institution-poor history. And I couldn't give you a real good explanation of why it happens then and there, but it does. So, I mean, Kuru is right about that. And I think it's at least very plausible that having this state ulama alliance sort of narrowed the range of Islamic thinking. I mean, if you're looking for people with wildly heretical ideas or intellectually way out ideas, you better look in the early centuries. They become harder to find in the later centuries. They don't disappear completely, but it's reduced.
Okay. So one of the overwhelming themes, I think, of your book is about how terrible it is to rely on slave soldiers. Like, they have this institution whereby they're importing these slave soldiers and then their slave soldiers turned against them. It's like, oh no, my slave soldiers have turned against me. Or there's fratricide. Because of the Islamic system of inheritance, you have brothers killing brothers. Or concubines carefully positioning their sons. Why is it that so many of the revolts and rebellions in the Middle East and North Africa were either rebellious slave soldiers like the Zanji in Iraq or these fratricides? Why do we rarely hear about peasant rebellions? Is that an artifact of the data, that it's just harder to record, or there was a bias against recording that? Or is it that the peasants didn't rebel? What's going on?
Right. I don't think it's an artifact of the data, but I would want to start by qualifying what you said. I mean, it's definitely not the case that all rebellions, or even I would guess most rebellions, originate within the state apparatus. I mean, certainly there's plenty of those, but tribal rebellions are a very big thing, and they keep happening all the time. But
So
where
tell
I
me
think
about
you're
those tribal rebellions.
sorry,
What would be an example of a tribal rebellion? So one
right,
faction within a city.
in the 1250s, you have a big Arab tribal rebellion in Upper Egypt, the leader of which says, "We have more right to this country than the Mamluks." And yes, I mean, the Mamluks are tough enough to suppress it, but it certainly diverted quite a lot of troops. And basically, whatever you have these nomadic Arab or Turkic tribes, they're a headache for the state. They can
Right,
easily
yes.
rebel. But I mean, coming to peasants, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there is a scarcity of peasant rebellion in the Middle East and North Africa. I mean, if you compare it to medieval Europe, 1381 in our country, or you compare it to China, the peasant rebellion bringing the Ming dynasty to power against the Mongols. We've got nothing like that in the Middle East, North Africa. Partly, I guess, it's that there just aren't that many peasants. In that, I mean, a lot of the agriculturalists of the Middle East and North Africa come to be tribal. It's as if, so to speak, there are people who would prefer being nomads, but they've been reduced to doing agriculture, and they don't do it in the same spirit as real peasants. So that if you take Syria, you can actually say, you're looking for peasants, look here and look here, or around the major cities. Egypt, again, is the exception with that tremendous sort of block of peasants in the Delta. But I mean, I don't have a good explanation, but maybe you need a kind of robust, large peasantry to foment peasant rebellions, such as we have in China and Europe, but don't have
Okay,
in the Middle East.
so I could understand that, some of these societies were oases in the desert, so there wasn't a large rural mass, but even a mass of like tax-paying townspeople or people complaining about the price of bread in towns and cities. I just wondered, what is it that's inhibiting that kind of horizontal solidarity? Is it tribal affiliations that people don't want to network across tribal lines, or is it sort of Ahmet Kuru's argument that the ulema are preaching obedience to the caliph, and people really internalize that? They think this is God's representative on earth, we must be loyal. So I don't know whether it's a social division between people or a deep felt religiosity and sense of piety.
Right, and surely Kuru is right in the sense that it's not doing the state any harm and maybe doing the state some good, that the ulama are talking obedience, sort of pushing the quietist line. But nevertheless, I mean, you take 18th century Cairo, there's a nice study of urban riots and disturbances there. So, I mean, and there definitely is, a kind of populist solidarity there. When the prices are going too high, they make trouble. But I think what is true is that, I mean, you never get regime change coming out of that, whereas you can get it coming out of tribal rebellion.
Okay, right. So my next question, building on that line of question about tribes, is what do you think about this hypothesis that Arabization led to the spread of cousin marriage, that because of prestige bias, and that's why there's so much cousin marriage around that region?
Okay, you know more about cousin marriage than I do. Let me start by saying
Well,
that.
I want to know your perspective.
But okay, I mean, if it's given, and I think it is, that the pre-Islamic Arabs had cousin marriage, and if it's given, which I don't really know, that the surrounding non-Arab populations didn't have it, and if it's a given, which I think it certainly is, that we have a lot of cousin marriage out there outside, the Arab homelands, then it certainly looks like they spread it. I mean, it seems a very plausible hypothesis, unless someone comes along and says, but they had it already in Iran, in Egypt.
There's a really nice study looking at genetic data, and they can trace endogamy back in past populations, and they see that in the nomadic pastoralist groups in Central Asia, they were historically exogamous, but as soon as they go into the cities, that's when they start adopting endogamy, so they can like
Yes.
time it. And so
Yes.
that seems to me like a pretty good influence of, say, like the madrasa
Yes.
institutions and Arabization. But anyway,
So,
we'll part that as a possible unknown. Okay,
right.
now I want to talk about theology. Because I'm super, how do you think theology has changed? The people like Ghazali and Rumi. What do you think that Islamic theology changed with their influence?
No, basically I don't. I mean, they are both very big figures. They both write what today would be bestsellers. What they write is sort of imitated. Particularly, I mean, Ghazali. I know more about Ghazali than Rumi, actually. But I mean, with Ghazali, he is in sort of Islamic terms, he's a Shafi'ite, Asharite. That's his law school. That's his theological school. But I mean, just about everybody in the Islamic world has some author, whatever law school or sect we're talking about, somebody takes Ghazali's Ihya and does a recension for his own people. You cut out certain things, you add certain things, but I mean, basically, that book was extraordinarily successful. So, I mean, that far I'm with you. Where I have my doubts is whether Ghazali really changed the trajectory of substantive views on any important things. I mean, I think basically he said what everybody was saying.
Right.
Said it in a more successful way in terms of being read down the centuries. But I mean, in terms of causal impact, I'm a bit skeptical.
Okay, so you're saying there's very little difference between the basic tenets of the Prophet's revelations and what Ghazali was saying, and both of them are just mediums bringing out the message. Okay, that's super interesting, because I was wondering, because we might expect a difference, right? If one is coming from the Arab Peninsula and the other is coming from Baghdad and Mesopotamia, we might expect some cultural difference in their ideas. Like, moving the Abbasid Caliphate to Baghdad, we might expect that to have some input into Islamic thinking.
Right, and that certainly does, and it's nothing to do with Ghazali, but it certainly makes the pre-Islamic Persian heritage more relevant. You're kind of sitting on top of it. Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, is sort of just upriver. So yes,
my reading, of gender histories, for example, is that Mesopotamia had been extremely patriarchal and had idealized female seclusion from 2nd millennium BC. That's my estimate. That's my estimate date. And so I think, you have two societies that both happen to idealize seclusion. So maybe it's like the perfect partnership, and maybe that wasn't much difference. What about this idea? One of the things that I think is so important within Islamic theology is the idea that our time on earth is short, and that what really matters is getting to paradise, and earth is just a testing ground. Has that idea always been around?
I think always, yes. I mean, it's very prominent in the Quran. It's prominent in preaching down the centuries. It's prominent today. Do I want to qualify that? I could, yes. I mean, and typically in Christianity, where you have the same basic idea, people worry a lot about whether they'll get to heaven.
Yes.
And it seems to be a fact about Muslims that by and large, they're not too worried about it. They take it for granted that sooner or later they'll get there, even though the preachers all the time are preaching about hellfire. So that's one thing. The other thing is...
Wait, just to clarify that, you don't think that hell is a major motivation for many Muslims today? The fear of hell?
I mean, at some level, I think it's a sort of psychological fact about large numbers of Muslims that they don't... I mean, sure, it's real, it's there, and the unbelievers are going to end up there. But, we won't. And the Prophet will intercede for us at the resurrection, and God will make allowances. And
Okay, I asked that. There's I'm segueing here. There's a wider debate about the axial age and and what led to the emergence of big cities. This goes far beyond Islam, but some people argue that moralizing supernatural punishment served to encourage pro-social behavior, to discourage cheating. That if you fear that there is a big God watching you, observing you, this goes for all the major religions, then you'd be more likely to behave. You don't buy that explanation of pro-social cooperation, the fear of a big God?
I mean, what it was like initially, I don't know. I wasn't there in the 5th century BC. But I think we tend to exaggerate the effect of hellfire preaching. And people listen to sermons, then they go home and go about their business in the usual way.
For sure.
In real life, it's social pressures that make us feel we shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that or should do the other.
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you. And that's why I think cousin marriage is so important, because then you have these very close-knit communities, and that enables a lot of policing.
Yes.
In fact, I recently interviewed a brilliant woman from Pakistan, and she went to Pakistani government schools, and she was telling me, there's such a strong emphasis on these strict rules and these threats of hellfire, but in her view, what was really motivating people was like your brother asking you, what are you up to, when are you coming home, and worrying about rumor and worrying about scandals and worry about staining your life in this system.
Yes.
So I think it's perfectly possible. Okay, yes. My next question, and thank you for that. So when do you think, what determines the rate at which people converted to Islam? So one thing I found so interesting is in your discussion of the Ottoman Empire that sometimes people permitted diversity. So why in Anatolia and in the Balkans did so many people convert to Islam? What was the motivation?
Right. Okay. Let me start by saying something about Anatolia and the Balkans, because I think there's actually an interesting contrast there in that in Anatolia, Christians become a minority by the 20th century, whereas in the Balkans, they remain a majority. And I would throw two possible causes of that. One is, simply in terms of the number of centuries they were under Muslim rule. Obviously, Anatolia has more centuries than the Balkans. So that's the boring point. The interesting point to my mind is the role of nomadic tribes. And Anatolia, from the 11th century onwards, nomadic Turkic tribes are a very big fact of life. And I think it's a very plausible theory. It's not this is something I'm taking from the literature. It's a very plausible theory that the maraudings of these nomadic tribes kind of wore down Byzantine rural society and kind of softened up the villages. It's remarkable in Turkey today how many villages have Turkish names, not perpetuated, pre-Turkish names. It's as if the impact on Byzantine rural society was obviously pretty massive. And
so I'm not clear. What do you mean by softening up? What did you mean by softening up the villages?
And if you have a village in a mountain valley where no Turkic nomads come, say in the region of Trebizond, it's much more likely that solid community in one piece is going to remain Christian into the 20th century.
Sure.
Happens, in that kind of place. Whereas by contrast, if you have a village that has been ravaged, a nomadic tribe has appeared and carried off girls and killed men. Sooner or later, you're desperate for some way to get some kind of protection. And being Muslim is at least going to make protection that bit more likely. And will also, maybe get the state to be more ready to step in and help you out.
So this, just for listeners who haven't read your brilliant book, this is the idea that Muslims are not allowed to enslave fellow Muslims. So if women are visibly veiling, then they should not, theologically at least, be taken as sex slaves, etc.
Yes.
So there's a very strong incentive for conversion.
So you have right on your side if you can get someone to enforce it.
So you
Whereas
think
like,
that the Balkans were just less attacked?
right, I mean, you do get some Turkic nomads penetrating the Balkans, but it's not on anything like the same scale. So basically, I mean, a Balkan village, yeah, there are bandits, there's all, and all the usual stuff, but that kind of repeated tribal marauding is not a feature of the Balkan predicament.
And what period are we talking about there? The violent
So
attacks?
anything from the 14th century down to the 20th
So you
for
think
the Balkans.
the nomadic attacks were persisting until very recently?
Ah, right, yeah, in Anatolia,
Yeah. Or they were just so
they
pervasive
certainly
early
do
on?
persist, but I think they're kind of at their maximum in the 14th century into the 15th. After that, to the extent that we get the emergence of a strong state, and to some extent we do, I think the high tide of Turkic tribal marauding has passed. They're
And
still
and
there,
and
but
to and to clarify, why do you think that the Turkic tribes were more militarily successful? Is this like a Peter Turchin idea that they just had better cavalry, better horses, better weapons, and therefore were dominant?
right. I think I mean nomads who spend their lives on horseback, before the invention of I don't know what, the machine gun or whatever. No, it goes back to the 18th century. But in the age of the cavalry, they are militarily in a very strong position.
Right, yes.
And I mean, in Anatolia, when the Turks come in, there are no, as far as I know, no existing horse nomads that would provide competition. There's no Christian horse nomads around. They're kind of moving into what, from a nomadic point of view, is empty territory. And I think, Turkic military power is one of those basic facts of a lot
Yes,
of
yes, yeah.
Muslim
Everyone
history,
always said the
whether
Turks
they're
were the best.
Mamluks or
Yeah, the Turks
nomads.
were the best. The Turks were great on horseback. Okay, I'm with you. I'm totally with you. The other fascinating thing that you said about the Ottoman Empire, there were so many examples of interreligious tolerance and syncretism, both among the elites and the ordinary people. Why was that?
Right. I think there's two things there. One is that it's actually quite natural for human beings who come from different religions but live side by side to rub off on each other. There's going to be hostility, but there's also going to be rubbing off. And in Anatolia in particular, you have this very long period of coexistence. So I don't think it's at all surprising they rub off.
But
The
wait, this
question,
is unusual because in the rest of Europe, in Spain, in Russia, there were much more violent pogroms against the Jews. Like the Ottoman Empire seemed, or maybe you don't agree, the Ottoman Empire seemed relatively happy with diversity. Like in Britain, we had an awful lot of, interreligious warfare, persecution, killing Catholics and Protestants. Like,
yes.
didn't the Ottoman Empire do slightly better in terms of rubbing off?
Um, I think one key thing about the Ottoman Empire is it does inherit this Islamic tolerance of Jews and Christians. So that, nobody has to have a bad conscience uh, in the elite and at the state level about letting Jews and Christians carry on doing what they've always done. If you're a zealot, I think you're better off in 16th century Spain, where there is no good reason why, in good conscience, you should tolerate people who don't come into the fold, compel them to come in. That's in the Gospels, isn't it? Whereas in the Ottoman Empire, there is a formal recognition that Jews and Christians, that's okay. They should keep their heads down. They pay extra taxation. They're humiliated when they pay it, but it's okay. They can carry on. There's still room for zealots, and they want to make a fuss about the fact that the Christians repaired their church 2 years ago. They can do that.
But but what was motivating this apparent harmony which, ebbed and flowed? Was it that they really valued Jewish people's skills? Was it that they weren't that religious?
Okay,
I think it's something that should be explained.
Yes. So, and if we're taking the Jews, yeah, I mean, the key thing there is the decision of the Ottoman state that we like getting all these Jews that are being expelled by the Christians. And I think one can see that, I mean, given the fact that tolerance is in principle not a problem, it's a very sensible thing to do. And many Europeans are saying, of the Spanish expulsion of the Moriscos, this is crazy. They're shooting themselves in the foot. And the Ottomans carefully don't shoot themselves in the foot. So I think at that level, that's fairly straightforward. At a popular level, I mean, we belong to a species that is very good at hostility, but also rather good at cooperation. And you're going to get both. And the cooperation, I think, is what leads to the rubbing off. So it doesn't seem to me that much of a puzzle. Okay. It becomes a puzzle only if you have a state or an elite that is committed to a kind of totalitarian imposition of a single persuasion, as in 16th century, 17th century Spain. But we don't have that.
Okay, going back to my question about Ramadan, do you think Ramadan was well observed in the Ottoman Empire?
I'd love to go back and do a survey. I guess you could do some research, and the only way to do it would be to go through all the travelers, and you'd find occasional snippets of information.
I bet large language models could do it. You program some large language model to churn through all this stuff. That's what we need. That's what we need. You don't want you and me to be like trawling through all these pages. But okay. Next question. Why do you think the Muslim world fell behind economically? So going back to Amakura, there was this great period of Islamic science and innovation, etc.
Yes.
And one argument which is heavily contested, and I want to know your theory on this. Did the Ottoman Empire ban the printing press?
Right. Okay, let's deal first with banning the printing press. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, there's no actual evidence of an edict being issued by the Sultan saying you may not print. And the most I can think of is that when Ibrahim Mutafarrika wanted to establish his press in the 18th century, he's told, yes, you can do it, but don't print any religious texts. I think I've got that right. I'd want to check before actually saying that in print.
That's interesting. Why would they say that?
I think that has to do, one, with the interests of copyists who spend a lot of time copying religious texts. And
so that's a trade unionist thing? The Ottoman Empire had this strong trade unionist copy movement.
But of course, I mean, that raises a perfectly good question. Why didn't German copyists in the 15th century get together and snuff out the printing press? No, I don't have a good answer to that.
Okay. What about falling behind economically? Because it was it was this great empire across the world. They were so economically successful all over.
Right. Okay, I would say maybe three things. One is just to refer back to what I said about the unforgiving geography. And we don't have the same kind of enormous, rich agricultural economy that we do have in northern India, China, Europe. So the Middle East, to that extent, I think, is disadvantaged. That's not a reason why it should decline, but it's a reason why it's not actually that high up. Two, I would say that the really major change that takes place is that something happens in Europe, and that's not my problem. As far as I'm concerned, Europe is a black box. But okay, your question, was there actually a decline? And I suspect that, again, I doubt if there was in India. I doubt if there was in Southeast Asia. But I think there could well have been in the Middle East and North Africa. And again, the factor I'm inclined to name here is tribal maraudings, nomadic tribes.
So this is Ibn Khaldun forever being right.
Yes. In other words, I should warn you that what I'm saying is heretical. It's not mainstream. You don't say these things in polite society these days.
Why not? Why is this heretical?
Somehow
There are parts of your books that I do think are heretical, but I didn't know this was one of them.
Right. Okay. I think in the mid 20th century, I think functionalism was a very widespread idea, that everything in society worked out for the better because everything had a function and all the functions kind of, worked together. And I think that made people inclined to look for functions, things being functional, which is a good thing because a lot of things are functional. But it also made them disinclined to take seriously cases where the sources were screaming that something very dysfunctional was happening. And I think the classic case of this is the Arab tribal, I would say, invasion. Other people would say something different. Invasion, the Arab tribal nomad invasion of Tunisia in the 11th century. We have contemporaries as well as later sources saying this was an absolute disaster. And the agricultural economy suffered very severe damage. And the fact of the matter is that down to the 11th century, Tunisia exports grain. After that, it doesn't. So it kind of looks like something bad happened. And then we have the spread of nomadic Arab nomads right across North Africa to Morocco, with the Berber population becoming increasingly confined to the mountains and on into Mauritania. And there's lots of diverse evidence in the sources, which is sort of dismissed on the orthodox view, saying people complain too much. But there's a lot of people saying, these nomads are awful. They're doing terrible things to the villages.
Okay, but let me take 2 points. So I don't know if you've seen Peter Turchin's argument about large empires. So he has the argument that the group with the greater military technology will be superior. He also argues that large empires formed on the border of this steppe as a defensive mechanism, that, if you've got these nomadic attacks, then you build up state capacity and maybe grateful peasants will come behind you because they desperately want that protection. But one of his sort of input variables is agriculture. So maybe to sort of synthesize these two views, you need a certain level of agriculture in order to get the tax base, in order to build the state. So even if there's an incentive to protect yourself from these nomadic attacks, if you don't have the agrarian tax base, there's not so much you can do. And then I think you bring in the brilliant linguistic points about how there's two different pronunciations in Arabic of Qaf. I don't know how you pronounce this. And there was one type, the Q type, which is more associated with the Bedouin nomads, and that type is now more dominant, suggesting that there's been this massive wave of attacks.
Yes.
I thought that was super nice. Please clarify the correct pronunciation, and I apologize.
Right. And what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. And if we take Iraq under the Sassanians, we take the Sassanian Empire, here we have a powerful empire that is building walls against nomads. I think both in the north against steppe nomads and in the south against Arab nomads. It's nothing on the scale of the Great Wall of China, but these are real walls that take you have to mobilize a lot of resources to put them there. And the further we get into Islamic history, the less those walls count for anything. They're down, and the tribes are already in. And right, that's one thing. And then the other thing, there was something else pronunciation. That's right. And the key thing is whether there's a letter which teachers of literary Arabic call Qaf, and the Bedouin pronounce it Gaf with a voiced G. And that Bedouin pronunciation in Abbasid Iraq, that would have marked you as an uncivilized Bedouin. In Iraq today, it's absolutely standard. unless you go either to the far north, to Mosul and that kind of region, or in Baghdad, well, down to the middle of the 20th century, the Jewish population retained the old Abbasid population, so did the Christian population. Perhaps the Christian population still does in talking among themselves, but I mean, out in public in Iraq, it's rough.
Okay, so then what you're telling me is, so whereas Ahmet Kuru would emphasize religious authoritarianism in these very strong repressive states, preaching obedience to the ruler, what you're saying is the tax base was low, and as you say so brilliantly in your chapter on the Mongols and the Turkic groups, that this is the only region on earth where you've got two walls of nomadic people attacking you. You know, in Britain we just had Hadrian's Wall. That was one border, right, against these tribal groups. Okay, I'm with you. I like to. It's a more economic lens, a more sort of agrarian, geographical lens, actually, I guess. Okay, that's great. That's great. Okay, now let's move on to South Asia. So this is actually going beyond South Asia. Why was Sufism so historically successful as a particular variant of Islam?
Okay, now, I mean, Sufism is my blind spot.
Oh.
I have a resolution to get to understand it in my next life, but I don't think I have much chance of understanding it in this life. But what I would say is there's something about the ulama that by and large, with a few exceptions here and there, they're not very good at handling the countryside. They can handle cities, urban populations, but outreach to the countryside is not their thing. And I think, the fact that Sufis were happy and willing to get out into the countryside must be a very significant point in their favor.
But I don't, because, if you look at Southeast Asia, if you look at West Africa, if you look at South Asia, the type of Islam that gains favor is Rumi Sufism. And I sort of just wonder, is it that all the merchants that went over to Southeast Asia, all the missionaries went over, were already Sufis? Like, was it some selection bias in, yes, if I'm going to be a merchant, I'm more likely to be Sufi? But it's just so, I find it very fascinating that you have the rise and fall of Sufism, right? Right up until the 1970 oil price shock, you get a very successful Sufism. But now, when I look at a lot of ethnographies of Bangladesh, Sufism is out the window. Those piers and shrines are out of the window, and now people are embracing the true Islam, which is the more Salafist one. So, what happened to Sufism? I find that interesting.
Yes, right. And I think, the key point is, or a key negative point, again, about the ulama. The ulama don't have a church. A church is what they would need to have control, religious control in the countryside, and they don't have it. And what has changed today is, it's modern communications plus oil money, has been, plus a lot of peasants from South Asia coming and working in the Gulf. All this has meant a massive transfer of, so to speak, ulama-type Islam into societies that were quite happy to, with Sufism in the old days.
Yes, I'm with you. Why do you call it ulama-type Islam as opposed to Arabian Islam or Salafism? Why do you call it ulama Islam?
Yeah, and maybe I shouldn't have invented that phrase just now. And I'm quite prepared. What I mean is a sort of a metropolitan form of Islam that has reason to regard itself as more authentic, and that people exposed to tend to say, "Oh yes, that is more authentic. We should be doing that."
Okay, I'm with you. Now, here is another big question. When did the Central Asian rulers of India start idealizing female seclusion? Because, as you write, on the steppe, these Turkic and nomadic group, women mixed and mingled with men.
Yes.
But I read one quote attributed to Timur that he said Muslim women should be veiled. When do you think they started embracing that ideal?
Right. And I kind of wonder where that quotation comes from. In that it doesn't fit. I suspect it's not true.
Okay.
For two reasons. One is, Timur is this great authority figure, so ascribing things to Timur he's a good person to have say what you want someone to say. But the other thing is, I think we have contemporary attestation of Timur throwing parties, banquets, where his women appear in mixed company, unveiled.
Okay.
So I find it a bit hard to imagine him saying that.
Okay.
But as to when, if we go from Timur, then we have the Timurids, and they're getting sort of much more civilized, and we get eventually to Babur. I don't know what Babur's women folk were doing, quite honestly. And what sticks in my mind is him saying about his maternal grandmother, she was a very savvy politician. So there's a kind of step attitude there. But I mean, did he have his women wrap themselves up? I honestly don't know. And then Akbar, something I find striking is the lack of conspicuous women at court.
Oh, for sure, for sure, for sure. And I think we see that in the Mughal paintings. Whenever you look at the Mughal painting, women are veiled. They're either on the upper floors. And we know that in the Mughal court, they patronized these Islamic texts. Like they really liked Rumi and Ghazali. Those were like the staples in the madrasas. So you think that female seclusion emerged at some time? And I think I read that Akbar's harem, no man, no boy over the age of 4 could enter it. So like that's clearly an ideal.
Yeah, that really is pretty extreme, isn't it? Yes.
So I'm just interested, like, when do you think it might have happened? Why do you think it might have happened?
Okay, when I don't know. I mean, I should know, but I don't know what the later Timurids were doing still in Central Asia. My guess would be that they'd already, to a considerable extent, adopted female seclusion. Why? I think it's surely a matter of acculturation.
Yes,
You come
absolutely,
into a
absolutely,
society where it's just
absolutely,
not respectable
yeah,
for
of
women
course,
to be out there unveiled.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, now here's another question which I think is a conundrum. Why is South Asia the only place, as far as I'm aware, where Muslims ruled for hundreds of years yet remained a minority? Why didn't the general drivers of conversion apply?
Right. Okay, first, point of fact, I think you have to include the Balkans as another example, even though the non-Muslim majority there is much less proportionally than the one in India. So it's not it's not actually unique.
But I thought we were saying that the Islamic rule in the Balkans was weaker and didn't last for so long.
Yeah, I would certainly. Of course, with India, depends what part you're talking about, since it sort of spreads gradually almost all the way down. Whereas the Balkans in the 14th, 15th century, the whole region comes under Muslim rule. Now, I mean, state weakness. I mean, is the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans weaker than the Mughal Empire in North India? I'm not sure. But sorry, what am I trying to explain? Remind me.
So I want to know, why did Hindus remain Hindu? Like, I mean, so the possible things that I thought of was maybe the jizya head tax was more weakly applied. Maybe the Hindu caste system is so strong that exit is very difficult. Like maybe Buddhists convert to Islam more readily, like in Bengal and what is now Pakistan, but the Hindu caste system is so strong that people just don't leave. So is it something about Hinduism rather than Islamic rule or something?
Right. Buddhism, I think the true answer is we don't know anything about the differential behavior of Buddhists and Hindus. Now, that's speculation, essentially.
Yes.
In terms of the caste system, I mean, I don't know, but probably like you, I have this image of Hindu castes as being communities that once you're out, you're totally out.
Yes.
And there's no possibility of return.
Yes.
Now, if you contrast that, I think, with the Balkans, and something interesting that scholars have been finding examples of, I think, over the last few decades, is Balkan kids, boys who were enslaved, became Janissaries. So they've broken completely with their religious community. But nevertheless, it turns out that they're in touch. so that you have one who I think he funds the building of a bridge in his native village, or you have Sinan, the great Ottoman architect, who actually is and he was enslaved in Anatolia and taken to Istanbul and spends the rest of his life as a Muslim. But nevertheless, there comes a time in his old age when his family is threatened with deportation to Cyprus. Not they've done anything wrong, it's just that the Ottomans want to populate Cyprus, which they've just conquered. And they want to take Christians there, Muslims there. And they're planning to take the people from the village that Sinan came from. And obviously these villagers must have contacted Sinan and said, look, this is a terrible threat. And he goes to the Sultan and he gets a decree saying, leave those people alone. Now, somehow my image of India is not like that once you're out, you're totally out. But I mean, that could be a stereotype that has some truth for some castes. I mean, there's thousands of castes, aren't there? And do we really know about all of them?
No, I think that's well supported. I mean, the whole idea of being out, I think that would be consistent with my date, and it's a mutually reinforcing system that no caste. So, for example, suppose there's a caste panchayat and they outcast one person. No other group will want to take them because they don't want to signal to their group that it's fine to leave. Right?
Yes.
This is the whole system where trust and cooperation and commerce is based on these close-knit groups, and you have to police outsiders so that everyone has trust in the system. So that would certainly be my view. Okay, so what do you think explains the geographical heterogeneity of Muslim conversion? So as you cite, according to the 1891 census, the Sindh and Kashmir were over 70% Muslim, but the south was just 13%. Do you think that's just longevity and or concentration of Islamic rule?
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of it is very simply explained. A lot of Islam in the northwest, and that's the area that is closest to the heart of the Muslim world, that is most settled by Muslims coming from the heart of the Muslim world, and that is longest ruled by Muslims. So that makes perfect historical sense. And equally, the fact that the south is there's much less conversion to Islam, given the fact that it's much further away, that it's less settled by Muslims from the north, and it makes it. None of that is very puzzling. The puzzle, I think, is East Bengal, where you get, why we have Bangladesh as a Muslim country there today. It's very far from the heart of the Muslim world. Yes, it was certainly ruled by Muslims for much longer than the South, but it's still a puzzle, and it's a puzzle which maybe has been solved by Dick Eaton in his book about it, in which he says essentially that, one big environmental change, the Ganges goes and changes its main course through Bengal. So suddenly there's lots of water in the eastern part of the country, so that it makes very good economic sense to get that part of the country settled and producing agriculturally. And what he argues is that the entrepreneurs who are settling peasants in that eastern part of Bengal are disproportionately Muslim, and they kind of settle the peasants and kind of install Islam with them. I don't think he's totally proved it, but he's made it a very plausible hypothesis. I think Bengal is the puzzle.
Let me say two more things. So do you think that Islamic rule, the Mughal rule in India, was any different in terms of accommodating non-Muslims within the bureaucracy? Like welcoming people, even if they weren't, allowing them to gain seniority and high status? Like, was that a distinctive feature of the Mughal, that as long as you're adopting these cultural signifiers, such as female seclusion and veiling, that even if you're a Hindu, you could still be a high-ranking official or a zamindar? So I don't know if there's a difference in incorporation. And secondly, could the Bengal story be that previously they weren't Hindu, so you don't have that mechanism of caste policing to stop them from becoming Muslim.
Or maybe in the course of resettling those people, they don't take their caste structures with them. I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, right. Sorry. Tell me again the other.
Oh yes, so I find it so curious that, and please correct me, but when I was in Delhi, for example, I interviewed people, they would tell me, my family was important these were Hindus. Hindus would tell me, my family was important in the Mughal bureaucracy. And was that a distinctive feature of the Mughal bureaucracy that would accommodate more non-Muslims as opposed to other regimes, and that sort of reduced the opportunity cost?
Yep, got it. Right, and I think there's a very real comparison with the Ottoman Empire in two respects. One is that while there are Christians in the Ottoman bureaucracy, it's not nearly to the same extent. In the sort of decades leading up to the Greek War of Independence, it's the Greeks of the Fener quarter of Istanbul who are the diplomats of the central government. But in the Mughals, the whole sort of the ministry dealing with finances is fundamentally Hindu. So I think there's a real quantitative difference there. And I think there's also a very significant qualitative difference. If we take it that respect is one of the most precious commodities in human interactions, we have respect in India. Not always. A lot of people don't like that at all, a lot of Muslims. But there are plenty of Muslims who are saying, in effect, we're here in this Hindu environment. We've got to come to terms with these people. We've got to show respect for their traditions. And Akbar, of course, is the sort of incarnation of all this. And
he was all for the diversity, and he really wanted to learn about different religions. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I think that's so fascinating.
It comes across, I think, particularly with the way he treats the Rajputs. That alliance, Mughal-Rajput alliance, it's not just a kind of alliance of convenience. There's genuine respect being shown to these Rajputs. I don't see that in the Ottoman case.
That said, there is this very nice book that I read on medieval Rajasthan, and it talks about these Rajput elites giving their daughters in political marriages, but being reluctant about doing so. Like, they'd rather not, but it's an instrumental strategic thing.
They'd rather not, but then there's something nice that goes with it.
Yes,
that they get to take a Brahmin or whatever to court and to perform their polytheistic sacrifices there in the Muslim court.
No, I'm with you. And I think what's fascinating is that this could be a major mechanism. So you don't see religious assimilation, but you do see cultural assimilation.
Yes.
In terms of food, in terms of dancing, in terms of architecture, and also female seclusion. Okay, I'm with you. Okay, now let's move on to Southeast Asia. So going back to Faisal Ahmad, he makes this argument that where Islam spread through conquest, the rulers imposed these Mamluk institutions. We've already criticized that a little bit with the periodization, but he thinks there was more syncretism when it spread through trade. What do you think of that as a mechanism?
I think that's absolutely right. The experience of being conquered is very different from the experience of being traded with. Conquest doesn't make friends, or not immediately. It's not a way to get people to like you, but they will certainly pay attention. And there's a very obvious, power gradient there. Whereas with merchants, there isn't that power gradient.
Right, you're not being compelled.
You're not being compelled in the same way. Not that forced conversion is a large part of the explanation for conversion to Islam, but the fact that these people have tremendous power and I don't, makes me think, maybe I should join them and do it the way they do it.
I guess I should have clarified, as I interpret it, when I think about conquest and religious and the spread of religious ideology, the mechanisms are one, the women, for example, converting to avoid being conquered, two, the women being taken as sex slaves and then that forced reproduction, so
Yes.
expanding the Muslim population.
Yeah.
Second, if you have conquest, then you might want to assimilate to the rulers to gain patronage. So I think so. It's not just necessarily like you must be a Muslim, but conquest comes with all these different incentives. Right? Okay. When you study the global history of Islam, what do you think is the best indicator that you can glean from the historical sources about how Muslim they really were?
And two obvious things would be female dress, especially in societies where traditionally people went topless or whatever. Do they wrap up? That's one. And the other would be in societies where you had pigs as a significant part of the economy. Do the pigs disappear?
Is there data on that you can see, like the existence and disappearance of pigs?
Okay, the one place that I'm sure you could collect data, and I haven't done it, but on the island of what's it called, Sulawesi.
Okay.
So we're in Indonesia, and down at the bottom of that island, sort of the bottom left-hand tentacle of that island, we have, I think, two polities that converted to Islam in the early 17th century, and at the time they had plenty of pigs. And then you have a traveler, I don't know, 30 years later, who says the pigs have disappeared. And you also get reports, the women weren't wrapping up before, and after, within a few decades, they are.
One thing I'm interested in is cultural change over the 20th century, and going back to our previous discussion on Wahhabism. It would be so interesting if we could find in Indonesia, in the early 1900s, was anyone eating pigs?
Yes, that would be very... For example, in the people on Java, in the northeastern highlands, Tengger, that area, did they have pigs? Very nice question. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would be confident. I think in an age where transport was very costly or dangerous, when we had wheat transport links, those Highland people, as you write, right? The Highland people were often maintaining their own pagan faiths. So you'd have lots. So I bet there were lots of pigs in the Highlands. I wonder how many pigs there were in towns.
Yes, right. Again, good question.
I bet some archaeology, bioarchaeologists can study pigs in people's. It'd be great. Or maybe there are some pigsties. Okay, I wish we could get people to study that. I think that's a great indicator.
And maybe one could find out something in the case of the Chinese Muslims.
Yes.
Because my sense is, I haven't seen any. I'm only accessing sources in translation, but I haven't seen anything that says, this is terrible. We have this Muslim community and they've still got pigs. Although, what you do get is, isn't it Matteo Ricci, who says that Chinese Muslims, if they can get a job in a government job, they will very readily apostatize and start eating pork.
I think that's great. Okay, I'm with you on pigs. And I think that's what we have to do when we're trying to analyze history. We have to look for these little clues that can tell us something. I'm totally with you. Okay, so coming on to sub-Saharan Africa, one thing that you said that I didn't understand, and this reflects my ignorance, a factor that weakens matrilineal polities is their tendency to diffuse power rather than to concentrate it. Can you explain what that means?
Okay, bad conscience. I lifted that from... Now, here you're embarrassing me because my Dutch pronunciation is for the birds. I think you pronounce it Duindam. He wrote a book called Dynasty, or Dynasty in our language, which is in the Oxford OUP very short introduction series. And near the beginning of that, he says exactly that, and I plagiarized it from there. Now, what I understood from what he says is that if you if you have a patrilineal system, the ruler's heirs are a sort of a block of brothers. Whereas if you have a matrilineal system, then the ruler's heirs are a sort of collection of cousins. In that sense, there's diffusion. But I think he was also indicating, and this is something I can't quite reconstruct, that there was a sort of wider structural tendency to diffusion in matrilineal systems. But fundamentally, this is again the kind of question I would ask you rather than try to answer.
Yeah, okay, so here's another question about sub-Saharan, I loved the section on sub-Saharan Africa because you give so many of these Arab travelers and they're going around Africa and they're like, oh my God, this is not Islamic, and they're writing columns of this is bad, these women are walking around naked. And as I interpret it, what you're saying is that, in an age with these high transportation costs and weak communications, then people might adopt Islam as another extra spiritual force, but not have very limited knowledge about what Arabian Islam is like. And I think one extra example of that is the way they design their mosques in the sort of Sahelian style that were just totally different from Arabian mosques. Totally different. Do you think that... Yeah, sorry.
No, sorry, what's the question? Yeah.
So the next question is, do you think that... So we've seen... So you paint this amazing picture of heterogeneity, right? So there are so many diverse practices of Islam in the Indian Ocean, in Southeast Asia, in West Africa, and East Africa. So much diversity historically. And I think people don't recognize that. They just think, when they think Islam, they think the Middle East, which is only less than 20% of the world's Muslims. So our view of Islam is totally distorted. But over the 20th century, there's been in many places religious revivalism. And I'm very interested in understanding why that might be. Do you think that colonialism triggered an Islamic backlash, that there is this threat to people's deeply held beliefs? Is there any evidence of that?
I think absolutely, yes. And you get sort of, I suppose, two major phases. One would be when it's kind of rebellion in the backlands, people like Abdul Qadir in Algeria against the French. And the other would be more recent, when you get it in Egypt, the formation of the Muslim Brothers, which is to a very large extent an anti-colonial movement or anti-imperial movement. Yes, and sort of in a way, you could almost say that nationalism is an interlude between that.
May I clarify something? So I guess there are two possible mechanisms. Is it that all over the world there was anti-imperial resistance, and in Islamic countries this just happened to take the veil of Islam as it always has, right? Going right back to those tribal insurgencies, they always say we are this particular sect, we are this particular ideology. So whenever there was a quest for power, it was always couched in Islam. So is it one thing that people were just rebelling against, horrible colonialism that they didn't like? Or was it that there was this secular threat, a threat to their way, a threat to their ideology, a threat to their deeply held beliefs, just as the American right, powered up the moral majority in the 1970s, that was a backlash against the anti-Vietnam thing, the Equal Rights Amendment. So I wonder, to what extent do you think it was an ideological backlash, or just a quest for power that happened to take the form of Islam?
Right. Okay, I certainly don't think it just happened to take the form of Islam. I mean, it's the fact that Islam was the dominating set of values in these societies. And if you want to be totally righteous, you invoke an Islamic value. So from that point of view, the kind of anti-imperial or anti-colonial sentiment that people would have anyway, Islam is a gift for articulating it. But about the secular aspect of it, I mean, I don't believe for a minute that the early rebels in the backlands, like Abdul Qadir in Algeria, Shamil in the Caucasus, were particularly perturbed about secularism, and they were perturbed about these people coming over here and pushing us around. But by the time you get to the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, at a time when there has been very extensive westernization already at many levels, I think it does become something very important. And it kind of encourages people to say, Islam is all embracing, which of course it isn't actually. And and there are plenty of sort of domains where God really doesn't care what you do. It's up to you. Do what you want. Um, but I think there is. What I'm trying to say is that there is a secular domain in Western culture, and there's a secular domain in Islamic culture. But the Western secular domain is a much larger and more aggressive one. And, government is fundamentally secular, and law is fundamentally secular. And both of those are very outlandish ideas, in a Muslim context. So it's not surprising that secularism should seem to be the enemy.
Yes. Okay, let me ask you a counterfactual question. But suppose there was no colonialism. Do you think it's possible that the Muslim world could have become more secular? Because there were, my reading is that, one, it was the threat of the Europeans and European dominance that led some reformers to think, we've got to change our way of doing things because we're backward and we need to compete, right? So there was that sense of, we've got to modernize, we've got to, this defensive modernization. That happened in Tunisia with the foundings of the Sadiki school, all these secular training activities. In Uzbekistan, there were lots of reformists in the 1920s. All these people wanted to compete, just as they did in Japan, right? The Meiji, etc. So I wonder, or is it possible that just that Western threat led to people to close up, to want to be more Muslim in sort of retaliation? Like, did colonialism make Islam more prominent and salient for people?
Prominent
and salient. Like, if there was no colonialism, might the Muslim world have become more liberal and secular of its own accord?
Right. And of course, the counterfactual, sort of the examples where that is actually the case are not very encouraging. That would be Yemen, North Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. Do we have any other parts? I think probably not. Neither of those, secularization is happening now in Saudi Arabia because we have a dictator who thinks things have to change. And, he's doing pretty well. It does seem that the ulama of Saudi Arabia turn out to be a paper tiger, so to speak, in the face of his efforts to demolish them. I think maybe... And I find a certain plausibility in the idea that, say, if a country like Egypt had not come under British imperial rule, then the kind of... in the 19th century, we have a Khedive ruling Egypt who builds an opera house in Cairo. Now, it's unimaginable that anyone would build an opera house, I think, in Cairo today. So that maybe if they'd been left alone, they would have... if they'd remained independent, so to speak, Islam would not have become so salient. That's one thing. But the other thing, I think there is, it's like I said before, that Islam has a domain of the secular, but it's a more limited one. And it's one that doesn't confer very strong normative status on things. What I'm thinking of here is, you go to medieval or early modern England, you have lots of institutions. There's a phrase of Ajemol who's strong society, right?
Yeah.
We have strong societies where there are lots of secular institutions like Parliament consenting to taxation, but there are all sorts of other institutions that have rights, and the rights are sort of widely recognized. And they're secular rights. We don't have that, I think, by and large, in the Islamic world. We have groups that within sort of internally secular rights matter a great deal. A tribe. Tribes have very strong ideas of how things should be done. But the wider society doesn't recognize them as being in the right, so to speak. it's hard to be strongly righteous, so to speak, uh, using a secular value
Yes,
in the
yes, yes,
Islamic
yes.
world.
I
Harder,
totally. I mean,
I think.
and that's true for many religions, with Buddhism too. That to make legitimate claims, you might invoke Buddhist values, for example.
Yes. Hmm.
I think that's a distinctly European thing that we might invoke secular. That's a European Enlightenment type thing. I don't think it's
Yes.
unique about Islam that they don't.
Right.
Okay, now let's move on to the 1970s. So since the 1970s, there's been two things. One, a global religious revival,
Yes.
and also a stronger embrace of Salafism. What is your explanation for that religious revivalism in Indonesia, in Pakistan, Egypt, and London?
Right. I don't have a good one. And to the extent that this is global, I would like to have an explanation that included Pentecostalism alongside the Islamic revival. And I don't see quite what does explain that. And one factor that is maybe relevant is insecurity. I know there's a kind of a theory, and I don't know how well it's regarded, that insecure people tend to go for supernatural sort of comfort more than secure people.
Yes,
So
yes.
that we have, I mean, what we have in the United States is still significantly different from what we have in Western Europe. But I think the indices are heading in the same direction.
Well, that said, though, so this is the Inglehart argument of modernization, that once everyone has their existential security, then they'll become these, tolerant people. But, Malaysia has become very wealthy, but has a very strong religious and conservative movement. And,
Yes.
Indonesia, and people in London. I mean, you go down Green Street and you can find lots of mainstream Islamic textbooks that say, it's World Hijab Day. Explain in your little workbook why wearing it's so important to be modest, to wear the hijab, and why our time on earth is short. I mean, I've been interviewing Muslims in London. They tell me about, there are these Wahhabi courses that are catering to mainstream professionals. And you may
Yes.
say, well, it's about relative status or something like that. But, London is relatively affluent, and or maybe, so I don't know. I mean, I certainly accept that when times are tough, when you're scared, when you're nervous, or when you're concerned about status, like guys joining the TLP in Pakistan, lower middle class groups, or lower middle class groups in Egypt struggling in the 1970s, them wanting the salience and support of being part of a religious group and the religious ritual being supportive in the sense that you're doing God's work and that can be
Yes.
affirming. But I find it harder to square that with the very strong religiosity of some perfectly wealthy
Right.
professional
Now,
groups.
say in London, it surely has quite a lot to do with identity.
Mm.
Um, I mean, the fact that there is such a thing as a Muslim identity within Britain today,
Yes.
but combined with the fact that there are people coming from Saudi Arabia or paid by the Saudis who are telling you, if you have this identity, then you must do X, Y, and Z. And where X, Y, and Z amount to a religious revival. And
The one
whereas,
thing I
and
find,
if you're Irish in Britain, it's not the same. You don't feel the same. I mean, you can't be blackmailed into Catholic observance simply because you're Irish in Britain, right?
so one thing, going back to your earlier point, that a good indicator of religiosity is women's behavior, women's dress, for example. If we look at the Office for National Statistics data on female labor force participation, among first generation Indian Hindu migrants, women work at very high rates. It's like 69% of them work, almost akin to white British women of working at 74%. But among Pakistani and Bangladeshis, Muslims, it's around 39%. So what you say about identity, so there seems to be among Hindu Indians a far greater readiness to culturally assimilate than compared to Pakistani and Bangladeshis, and that holds even for second generation immigrants, but the gap is slightly smaller, so they are culturally assimilating. But yeah, so I was curious. I mean, so one possibility is it's just Saudi-inspired Salafism, and the sense that the true version of Islam means adopting these Salafist ideas.
But I think, I mean, certainly, this Saudi use, the way the Saudis chose to use their oil money is very important.
Yes.
No doubt, no question. But I mean, there is something about the Islam of the diasporas that they were concerned with, that kind of ensured that the Saudis had a soft landing. I mean, you could easily imagine a situation in which people in London are saying, the Saudis, why do we bother with them?
Okay, so what's your okay, let me ask you another counterfactual question. Suppose oil had never been discovered in Saudi Arabia, what would the Muslim world look like today?
I think it would look significantly less Salafized than it is. But I think that nevertheless, there would have been a strong measure of homogenization arising, and we've taken, so to speak, Saudi agency out of it. But nevertheless, modern communications makes people aware that the way they've been doing things all along is not how they're supposed to be done in the metropolis, so to speak. And I mean, it's a fact about Islam, about pre-modern Islam, that there was quite a strong sense of a metropolis. The way people did things in Mecca, that must be right. And we should be doing that too.
And why is that, like, in Christianity? I mean, obviously religion has a lot of cultural evolution, but I'm not aware in Christianity of the idea, we've got to make sure we're doing what they were doing in Bethlehem. Is that a distinctive thing? That, this emulation of the pious ancestors, is that an innovation of Wahhabism? As I understand, that's how Salafism translates. Is it a new thing, or has it always been going on? The Prophet's generation is the most pious.
Yes.
Those 3 generations, they're the most pious. We must always get back to them. And so are you saying that across the Muslim world, there's always been this idea that the first 3 generations were the most pious, we've got to get back to them, but just some people were unaware of what they were like. And so, like, you gave these great stories about where people were imagining what Mecca was like, and it was a jungle, right? Southeast Asia, they imagined it was a jungle because they just didn't know what it was like.
Yeah, right. I think that's basically right. That, I mean, part of this religion, and this is a religion with, how did I put it? It has a strong anchor.
Right.
There are certain texts that, if you're serious, you have to go back to. And people who are not aware of that, but nevertheless claim to be Muslims, are asking for someone to come along and say, hey, what you're doing is not right. This is how we do it. And it's an interesting question you raise. I mean, I don't think that this is the case with Buddhism, actually. I mean, sort of Chinese Buddhists, to my knowledge, don't start worrying that we're not doing our Buddhism the same way as they do in Sri Lanka, say.
Yeah, for sure.
There isn't the same sense of a metropolis there. Maybe there is among Theravada Buddhists, I don't know.
I think that the interesting comparison for me is Judaism, because, as you know, there are so many similarities. You're right. There are so many similarities between Judaism and Islam, both being born from Semitic people, both having these very strong codes, both of dress, of food, of ritual. And you talk about they all have the same textual practice of he said, he said, he said. They both do that.
Yes.
And I think, from my reading is, going back to our friend Adimoglu, that, the Jewish Enlightenment happened because there were many Jews in Europe. And so you see the emergence of reformist Judaism. And that didn't happen for Islam because you didn't have Muslims living in Europe at the time of the Enlightenment. And maybe if you did, perhaps there would have been a Muslim Enlightenment. I don't know what you think of that. Because if you compare the Jews living outside Europe in the Middle East, they're very, very different. And they didn't have that same Enlightenment process. And of course, with the Jewish Enlightenment, you also had that backlash process and some people embracing the Orthodox Islam. We've got to do everything in Hebrew, or we've got to have these very strict codes. Here in Stanford, I've been going to a Chabad house, or Habat house, I think it's pronounced, learning about Orthodox Judaism. So I wonder if there's a point about, that some Jewish groups just were living in a place with these institutions that enabled enlightenment, and they adopted those values. And so that's why they ceased to think we've got to get back to our pious ancestors. We can, we can reform some of our things. We can embrace the modern world because there are all these kinds of advantages. And I think that might intersect with the fact that, yeah, so let me caveat that. I think it intersects with the fact that Jewish people, because of past pogroms perhaps, were already specialized in human capital, and because of this mandate of reading the Torah, so you had this super, super high educated group that was doing well in commerce. So if you're very highly educated, there is a stronger rationale to embrace secular institutions because the payoffs are so great.
Yes. Yeah. I like that idea. And what I would bring into it is the case of the Muslims of China. I mean, that is the one case where we have a significant Muslim population that is under non-Muslim rule in pre-modern times. So it's a kind of anticipation of what's going to happen in most of the rest of the Muslim world. And you certainly could run a comparison between, Jewish Enlightenment, and you could say there's this Chinese Muslim Enlightenment, which consists in saying, hey, we really have to read these Confucian texts. And Confucius really did have something going for him. And actually, his ideas aren't so different from our own ideas.
Did that happen in the Uyghur populations, that people saw benefits? I mean, to what extent was it real like Confucianism versus, hey, I want my son to gain an honorable position in the imperial bureaucracy, like economic incentive?
I think, the two go together.
Yeah.
Because, you do your Confucian education properly, then you're going to get that position in the imperial bureaucracy, and then your family is made, and they'll be immensely grateful to you. But yeah, I think the word enlightenment is one that one could use in that Chinese Muslim context. We're talking about 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. It is a sort of a large-scale taking on board of the ideas of the dominant culture. And the same way as you say, it enables you to take advantage of opportunities that otherwise would be closed to you.
And I suppose maybe there's a parallel between the Chinese imperial bureaucracy, whereby any man who sat those examinations, who learned his Confucian text, could gain a high-ranking position. Maybe there's a similarity between with the Hindus under the Mughal Empire, right? There's an incentive for cultural assimilation in both ways.
Yes, yes.
So maybe that's a similarity. Okay, I have one more question. Muslim states today tend to have weak state capacity. And Timur Kuran, I don't know if you've seen his new book, Freedom's Delayed, and also his previous book, he blames Waqf. What do you think is this, and my pronunciation is bad, what do you think of this explanation?
Okay, to be honest, I haven't read his discussion of Waqf in that context of state weakness. And what I would say is that, again, going back to geography, I think state weakness is quite likely in that whole region. And it's the exceptions that sort of stand in need of explanation.
Okay, wait, so let me just go. So Timur Kuran has this idea, and I should explain for listeners, that under Islam that people could sort of invest and save and put grants into these institutions, whether it's a school or a university or some sort of public service device, and then you could appoint overseers who would look after this money, and then everyone invested their time and effort into guarding this thing, whatever it was. And because people were more invested in these waqfs, that they didn't mobilize to get improved state capacity or improved service delivery. I'm going back to your point. Do we see any, I guess the question is, do we see any variation, going back to your point on geography, do you think that the states were any stronger in places where there was more fertile agriculture, like Indonesia, for example, or South Asia? Like that would be a good challenge to his theory.
Okay, so leaving Quran on Waqfs aside, certainly I would say that, I think the Mughal Empire was a stronger state while it was strong than the Ottoman Empire, even while it was strong. And I would put that down, yes, to the vast agricultural revenue that you can rake in northern India. Of course, even the strongest states are subject to weakening, and that happened dramatically in the case of, I think, the Mughal Empire became weaker in the 18th century than the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were doing well in comparison.
Yes, yes, for sure. So why
But
do you
at
think the
its
Mughal
height,
why do you think the Mughal Empire suffered again? Why was it, it was already weakening with the Marathi resistance, for example. Why do you think the Mughal Empire fell behind?
right. The Marathas are certainly a very interesting factor there. And they're doing a fantastic amount of marauding, which is almost like tribal marauding. There are no Arab or Turkic tribes in India, but the Marathas were obviously a real pain for a large part of the population.
Yes, yes.
But I've gone off the. Just give me the.
Oh yeah, okay.
Two words of the question again.
Oh my God! So this is my problem. I have so many questions. So what explains the Muslim state's weak state capacity? And then I said, why did the Mughal state fall behind? Because it was already weakening by the time the East India Company came along.
Okay, I've got my thoughts back. I think a very plausible hypothesis would be that succession arrangements are crucial. Now, in both the Ottoman and the Mughal empires, we had succession by fratricide, formally approved in the Ottoman Empire, de facto in the Mughal Empire. Now, the Ottomans in the 17th century, they abandoned that. And that, I think, is part of their shifting to a kind of low energy state, but nevertheless a state that survives as a real empire, even if a much weakened empire, that you no longer have these fantastic succession crises that you had in the 16th century. So that enables them to carry on at a lower level for longer. The Mughal Empire, by contrast, it's that Aurangzeb who goes and lives much too long. He dies in his 90s. So his successor is already an old man. And you then get a period when there's, instead of having one short, sharp succession struggle, like the one where Aurangzeb came to power, you have this sort of period of, this continuing period of succession struggle. And that obviously did much more damage to the state than the short, sharp version. That could be a theory.
Okay, I'm with you. Professor Cook, those were all my questions. I think we're now into 90 minutes of your expert wisdom, and I wanted to thank you very much again and to say to all our listeners, Michael Cook's A History of the Muslim World is out now, and it's absolutely fantastic. It goes into these themes and many, many more, and I really recommend it. So Michael, thank you very much.
And thank you very much for your remarks about my book and your questions, and this has been a real fun discussion.
Awesome, brilliant, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.